Guys, my wife is insisting that I give the entire inheritance away. Give the will away, take it from our twin daughters, and give it to one person that you would never guess. The maid at our house. This is a crazy story. Let me tell you exactly why, and I promise you, you would not see this coming. Life is all about making sacrifices. Family is all about sacrifices, and I've done a lot to keep my family in check. I'm the second son of my parents who just had 2 kids. My elder brother and we grew up in Western Africa, and things were not as rosy as they are today because there was little technology available to us. This, however, did not stop my parents from sending my brother and I to school so that we could get white-collar jobs and help the family survive. My brother and I were really close, and so there was not much of sibling rivalry between us. We did and shared practically everything together. We went to the same university in the city, though my elder was a class ahead of me, and it was there that the city life changed him for the worse. He plunged into a life of debauchery. I had to apply wisdom in the ways I related with him, and this led me into distancing myself from him. During my university days, I met Anne, a lady who hawked fruits around the area where I lived. She was really beautiful, hardworking, and very meticulous in the way she handled her business. But, as was common with guys, they all tried getting into her pants, and some of them did. Stories went around among the guys in my area of how sexually loose she was, and how it was quite easy for them to have slept with her. I felt disgusted by those stories because besides the fact that I never supported someone sleeping with various women, as though he was changing his clothes, I thought it was unfair to speak ill of a lady who willingly gave herself to you. I finally crossed paths with her when I needed to buy some fruits, and that was how we began talking. I looked past her past. I had always believed that everyone deserved a second chance, not minding what they've done in the past. We began dating while I was in my final year, and I introduced her to my elder brother, who was already working at a retail store. He knew about the lady. A friend of his actually slept with her, but my brother withheld the information from me. He had an ulterior motive, see. I graduated from the university, and as luck would have it, I got a job within an oil firm. Things were okay, but they were about to get better as the oil firm who I worked for decided to send me overseas to undertake a 1-year course, after which I would be given a key position of authority when I did return. And then I would get married to the love of my life, Anne. I told her my plans for marriage when I returned, and she promised to stay and wait for me because I've proven beyond doubt that I loved her, and I was not just after her body, and I paid no attention to her dirty past, one which I did not tell my people about. Well, we had memorable sexual sessions the night before I left. I was going to be away for a year, and she had to make sure I was satisfied so that I would get into another country, in a different continent, and start going after women who might replace her. I, on the other hand, was not afraid of leaving her on her own. I had grown to trust her. She'd never given me a reason to distrust her since we've been together. People who knew her then could tell that there was a radical change in the girl that was termed a public property. Some had even approached me to tell me how the advances made by them was turned down by my wife. I left the country for the course, and that was when the window my brother needed to execute his plan came. He reached out to my wife and used her past to blackmail her into sleeping with him, otherwise he would reveal all he knew to the family, whom he was sure would vehemently kick against their son getting married to her. He promised that it was going to be a one-time affair, and that was how he pressured her into sleeping with him. It was just barely 2 days after I left Africa for Europe. My fiancée felt bad about the whole thing, but she refrained from telling me over the phone, so I would have less things to worry about. It turned out that she was pregnant 2 weeks after sleeping with my brother. She felt devastated. She did not know who the father of her child was, and she slept with 2 people within the space of 2 days. And DNA testing was not rampant in my country back then, and even if it were, very few people would be able to afford it. The shame of everything was too much on her to bear. There was a lot at stake. She'd been given a shot at making something meaningful with her life, but she was at the verge of ruining it for the second time. Well, she left the city and relocated back to the village to stay with her mother till she'd given birth. My brother and we were kept in the dark about the pregnancy. She finally gave birth to a baby boy 9 months later and had 3 months to shed some weight before returning back to the city. She kept the boy with her mother. I flew into the country a week after she returned to the city. We were both ecstatic to finally be reunited with each other, but I noticed that something was weighing her down. I inquired to know what the issue was, but she claimed that there was none, so I just let the matter slide. As expected, my firm made me the Chief Operation Officer. I finally had the resources to get married and give my family a comfortable life. I proposed to Anne, but she turned me down. It came as a rude shock to me because there had always been an understanding between us right from the start. I pressed her to know the reason behind her denial, as I was sure that I had not offended her in any way. I never had a secret lover throughout my 1-year stay overseas, and my intention towards her had always been pure. With tears, Anne confessed to me about her one-time affair with my brother. I listened with pain as she narrated how the whole thing happened. I would not deny the fact that I was hurt by what my wife did. I trusted her, and she broke that trust by sleeping with no other person than my very own brother. I, however, did not act how most people in my shoes would have acted. Even though Anne hurt me, I was grateful for her honesty. Some other person would have kept quiet about it. It was clear that my brother exploited her past against her, but I was not going to leave her because of that. I arranged a meeting with my family and parents. Brother and Anne were all present. I recounted what my brother did before my parents, but rather than rebuke him for wronging his junior brother, they began verbally attacking Anne for trying to, quote, tear up the family. I was very displeased with the way they handled it. I left with Anne, but I made it clear to them that I was no longer a part of their family, and there was never going to reach out to me. Anne spent weeks trying to regain my trust, and she finally did. 6 months after the incidents, we got married. Our marriage produced 2 twins who were as beautiful as their mother. I did my best to provide and protect my family. I'd set up a clothing business for my wife while I'd risen to the managerial position in the firm where I worked. As my family grew, it became clear that we needed a house to help assist with the chores at home, and that was when my wife suggested bringing Joe, a boy from her village. Joe was 18 years old when he came into our house, 3 years older than my daughters. He was hardworking and easily blended with us. One thing I found funny was how people who were not very well acquainted with us mistook him for my own son, the very first time they met him. Joe looked like me in a physical feature and character. I even began treating him not as an outsider, but as one who was part of the family. Things, however, took a radical turn when my wife began suggesting that I make Joe the heir to all I owned. I found it really strange that she would come up with a suggestion. Why would my wife start entertaining thoughts of me pushing my daughters to the side and making someone who was not my blood the heir to my fortune? I made her understand that she may have taken the whole Joe is my son, Joe is family thing too much. I had to remind her that although Joe was being taken care of as though he was our blood, the sad reality is he's not. My wife seemed to let the issue slide for some time, only to resume the whole issue again. In a bid to pacify my wife, I made a promise to her that I would not let Joe leave our house empty-handed. I was going to set him up with enough capital to establish himself. This promise made by me and my wife was supposed to put an end to this insistent nagging about making Joe my heir, but let me tell ya, it did not. It only fueled it. This got me really bothered because I saw no reason why my wife would vehemently push that I make him my heir. She even began denying me sex to see if I would cave into her demands. In a bid to make sense of what this whole issue was about, I began entertaining various thoughts which led me into becoming suspicious. Was my wife sleeping with Joe? I began keeping a close watch on my wife just so that I could get answers. At this time, my daughters had been admitted into college overseas, and though I advised them to avoid distractions, I knew that they would soon start entertaining suitors. I noticed that Betty, who was the younger twin, had grown very close with Joe, but when I told my wife about my observations, she kicked against any form of romantic relationship between the two. Her reaction further incensed my suspicion that she and Joe may have a thing going on. Otherwise, why would she be opposing of two adults from getting into a relationship that could lead to marriage if she was not jealous? Tension began brewing in my house. My wife and I began growing distant, and I poured the frustration on Joe. I became hostile towards him, but he still maintained his friendly attitude even though he was confused about my sudden change in behavior towards him. He finally approached me to find out why I was no longer friendly to him, and that was when I asked him if he was having an affair with my wife. He firmly said no. His tone carried an air of confidence that suggested he was being truthful. I was all the more confused. Why then was my wife so jealous over his matter? I sent Joe out of my house empty-handed, much to the dismay of my wife. Days passed and things only worsened between my wife and I. I was soon on a business trip when I got involved in an accident. I was rushed to one of the top hospitals in the city, and the doctor noted that I needed to have a blood transfusion, as I've lost a lot of blood in the accident. I needed a blood donor, but my daughters, who would have been a perfect match, were far off in another continent. My wife suggested to the doctor that Joe be tested to see if he was liable to act as my donor. She had already pleaded with Joe to come and save my life. Well, the test results came out to be positive. He was a perfect match. The transfusion took place, but I remained in a coma for about 2 weeks. I finally regained consciousness on the 3rd week. It was shortly before I left the hospital that the doctor informed me that my son had saved my life by acting as my donor. I was grateful that Joe was a match, but I still informed the doctor that he had joined the league of those who mistook Joe for my son. Well, my response came as a shock to him. He began advising that I reconcile with my son, as it would not be fair to disown the only son I had. I remember laughing at the doctor's naiveness before informing him that Joe was just at my house to help, who had been living with me over the years. The look on his face showed something was wrong. He pulled up a file and handed it to me. A part of the test carried out to determine the perfect match for the blood transfusion requires the DNA sample of the donor. Joe's DNA matched mine. Joe was my son, there's no denying it. I just sat at the doctor's office looking shocked at the revelation. I'm glad that I did not collapse as a result of it. How could Joe be my son? I only knew him when he was 15 years old, and I was certain that my wife and I gave birth to just 2 girls. There had to be an explanation for this. I left the doctor's office and headed for home to get answers from my wife, as the doctor suggested. My wife was taken aback when I confronted her with the question. She never expected that I would find out. She was not even exposed to no recent developments made in the medical field, such as DNA discovery and the rest. She only had strong suspicion that Joe was my son simply because of the resemblance between him and I. It was striking, and that was why she suggested to the doctor to try Joe since his bio daughters were not around. Seeing that I held the DNA result in my hand as proof that Joe was indeed my son, my wife began confessing that she's discovered she was with the child 2 weeks after I had left the country. And even though she disclosed the truth about her affair with my brother, she knew that there was every possibility I would not get married to a lady who slept with 2 brothers and was pregnant for one of them. I thought I've heard the worst, but then she further disclosed that when she gave birth, she kept Joe with her mother, only visiting once every 3 years as his aunt. He was lied to him that his parents were dead. It all made sense now. She wanted me to will my property to Joe as there was a high possibility that he was my child. She kicked against the relationships between Joe and his sister Betty because they were related by blood. My heart was shattered. It was too much for me to take in. She had deprived me of growing with my son, and she's deprived him of knowing the love of a father. Worse still, I had sent my son out of my house simply because I thought he was sleeping with his own mother. I wept like a little kid, a little lady for days unending. Anne had caused me an injury that would take time to heal. I'd made sacrifices for her. I defended her in front of my family and even cut off from them because of her, and she repaid me by keeping my son away from me. I didn't send her out of my house, but I ignored her for days, till my daughters came back. I broke the news to them, and it equally broke their hearts. Their mother had behaved badly. I went in search of Joe and apologized to him immediately. He readily forgave me, but asked that I forgave my wife too, and that's what I did. We became one big family, and even though I did not will the whole thing to Joe, I did include him in my will. He was my son after all. At the end of it all, I decided the peace was the best. On top of the bright side, Joe was my son, and even though I missed out on his childhood, we could utilize the time we had left to catch up on lost times. I think the saddest part of this entire story is the fact that if OP never got injured, he would never know who his real son was, and that poor boy would have thought he never had a father in his life, when the father was just one phone call away. Guys, let me know exactly your thoughts on this. This story was kind of heartbreaking to me, and it's hard for me to read sad stories like this, but at least they're reunited, and OP did get his life saved by his long-lost son. And also, I just want to mention, his brother is an a-hole. Guys, drop your thoughts down below. This is the only story on the day. It was a long one. I hope you enjoyed it. There's going to be more on the channel every single day, so subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day, guys.